You know, in most companies, no one owns the space or the gaps between two teams, like between recruiting and sales or sales and finance. But in the org of the future, the CHRO will be the one that owns the gaps. And in order to do that, they have to think like an engineer. Welcome to the channel. I am Trent Cotton, the human capitalist. I've noticed that there's a big difference between HR business practices and how business actually gets done. I've spent over 20 years in HR helping the C-suite rebuild their organization while the world around them shifted. I've designed this channel to be an intelligence briefing on the business of people. So, if you're a CEO, board member, or a CHRO looking for the signal in the noise, welcome to the channel. Now, let's get to work. Welcome back. Let me give you a quick recap. I am making the case of the traditional CHRO. That role is becoming absolutely obsolete. And what's going to replace it is the modern CHRO that has to operate across 5 distinct personas: the architect, the engineer, the scientist, the COO, and the coach. In episode 2, we went very deep on the architect, and that's the persona that understands the entire organization as a system and knows how every room or how every team is wired together. So if you think of the architect as the one who understands the entire organization, the engineer is one step deeper. They understand where all those connections are, and more importantly, they're obsessed with fixing the gaps. So here's the reality of what most HR organizations look like today. 63% of HR professionals describe their function as the company crisis line or the dumpster fire. And that's according to HiBob's 2025 research. And I can tell you from my experience, HR was the crisis hotline, or at least that's what the organization saw it as. It did not see HR as being a strategic function or even a growth driver, just the place that you call whenever shit hit the fan. And Deloitte actually did some research and found that 41% of HR's time, nearly half of the working day, is consumed by tactical and administrative work, not strategy, not system design, admin. And let's also talk about performance management. Gartner found that 98% of CHROs are unhappy with how performance management is done in their organization. And yet, the function that's responsible for fixing this, they're too busy spending time putting out fires to actually look at how do we get the most performance out of our organization. So the problem isn't data. HR is infested with data, and that's one of the reasons I liked HR. But the problem that I always found is that these data points were never really connected to give me a full value or a full 360 view of what's really going on in the organization. So essentially, HR is a data-rich department, but insight poor. And that gap between the data and the decisions, that's where HR should be. And that's where the engineer persona of the CHRO of the future, that's what they're going to be obsessed with. And look, this is getting more urgent by the day. And if you go back and watch episode 2, you can see AI is accelerating every function of the organization simultaneously. HR is implementing AI for recruiting, sales is implementing it for forecasting, and marketing is looking at it for outbound. All of it going at the same time. And Gartner found that 82% of HR leaders, they plan to deploy agentic AI within the next 12 months. Now, that's the autonomous type of AI. So, shameless plug, if you want to check out more on my thoughts on what's really crushing the middle management layer, check out the piece that I wrote on Fast Company. I'll drop a link in the description. So what we're heading to is a perfect storm because the gap problem is getting worse exactly at the same moment that AI is making it more expensive. And somebody has to own those connective tissues or those gaps within the organization. And in the modern org, that responsibility, it belongs to the CHRO, but only if they're operating as an engineer. Now, before we get into what does that engineer persona look like in a CHRO, let's look at what an engineer does in real life, because that mindset is very specific and it's different from what most people assume. So sticking with our same metaphor, the architect is the one that designs the entire building. The engineer's job is not to do the design, but it's to find where the system fails. So the mindset of an engineer kind of hits home because my daughter is studying to be a civil engineer, and it fascinates me how she just falls in love with the problem and she's looking for the gaps and she's trying to understand the data. She's not trying to design the system, she's trying to make it better. And in my previous life, I was always interested and kind of fascinated as well by software engineers. They're looking at where does the data transfer and how does that operate in the code, and where is the handoff not happening, because that's what's going to create the bug, which is going to affect the overall production. And it really was a mindset. You can tell the good engineers because they just thought about things differently. And what I learned is that engineers are not generalists; they're gap specialists. Their value comes entirely from how they're able to see the two systems where they meet and identify exactly where the process needs to be enhanced. So the modern CHRO, they're not going to own any single function's process. That's not the job. The job is to find where sales process ends and talents begins and close that gap. To find where finance is making workforce decisions without the right people data and close the gap. They're able to find where two functions are running parallel when it comes to AI implementation or new AI software, and they recognize that no one's coordinating and they're able to close the gap. Now, let me give you an example of one because I actually lived this. I was brought into an organization where sales was consistently missing the target, and new reps were taking significantly longer to actually hit their quota according to what the model projected. And we all know how models are, right? But sales leadership was absolutely convinced that it was a recruiting problem. The recruiting team actually pointed back to the sales leadership and said they don't know how to coach. Both sides were defending their function. Neither side was looking at the space in between them. So I had to sit down with the sales team and we did a performance audit. We looked at their high performers and tried to determine what are the skills, both soft and technical, that made these people so successful and created a success persona. And then we backed into, okay, if these are the skills that we're looking for, what are some of the questions? How should we change the interview and what should we be looking for? And sat down with the recruiting team to be able to communicate that. Now, surprise, surprise, we realized that the sales leaders were giving a job description that really didn't meet the mark of finding a higher performer, and the recruiters weren't asking the right questions to be able to pull that out of them. But once we locked in, once we closed that gap, we started to see that ramp up time for new sales reps slowly diminish to roughly, I think it came down to about 6 months, but it was 18 months before we started this. And that's what an engineer does. It brings two different parties and say, let's talk about the real problem. Let's get to that root case. And rather than just diagnosing the symptoms, let's look at where the gap is and how do we close it and move the organization forward. So if I were on a board or if I were CEO and I was looking for that engineer persona or mindset within a CHRO candidate that I was interviewing, here's some of the things that I would look for. All right, so number one is a gap mapping as a discipline. So the engineer CHRO, they don't wait for a broken handoff to become a crisis. They map the organizational boundaries within departments proactively. And they ask questions like, where does the process handoff from this department to this department? What is the information that transfers across that boundary? Is it complete? Is it being used? And these are all questions that you can apply to each different department handoff. And it's not a one time exercise, it's an ongoing operational discipline. One of my favorite tools to do this is the DACI, DACI. You can also use a RACI, but it's easier for me to remember the DACI. And it's figuring out, okay, for this task, who's the doer, who's the approver, who needs to be consulted, and who just needs to be informed, and what data needs to be transferred over. And if you have that for the entire organization, it helps be able to identify the gaps. But more importantly, as a CHRO, it really gives you a good inside look at what's going on in the organization. All right, number two, I would be looking for someone who is absolutely obsessed with the handoff point. And what I find is that most executives, they focus on what happens inside their own function, their own little fiefdom. Now, the engineer persona, they're going to be focused on what happens between those functions and that connective tissue. And the handoff point is the most value, and that's where it gets lost. So a process can run perfectly inside of a function and still fail completely at the boundary or at that handoff point. That's why you need to be so obsessed with finding those handoff points and finding the best way to maximize the value and the handoff of information. All right, number three is cross functional fluency without cross functional ownership. This is something I find a lot of CHROs struggle with. they want to be valuable in that cross-functional way, but they confuse ownership with fluency. So that whole idea of this engineer mindset is not to take over the process. It's just to get fluent enough to understand how the functions work to be able to identify those gaps. Now, the goal is not to expand HR's territory or its reach or to become the police for every department. It's to make the whole system perform better. And the best way to do that after you map it out is to become very fluent in what's going on in the organization. And then number four is a new one, AI integration as the gap closing tool. So as AI moves into every function independently, the engineer CHRO, that mindset, they're going to be watching for new gaps that it creates. Where is one function's AI producing outputs that another function can't use? Where is the data being generated that no one is using? That engineer mindset, they see AI implementation not as a function by function project, but as an organization wide integration challenge. And they're the ones that are making sure that the pieces are actually talking to each other. And that's going to enhance and increase AI adoption within the organization because that is a people problem. So here's the bottom line on this. Organizations don't fail because their functions are bad. They usually fail at the seams or at the boundaries. And in a world where AI is moving into every function simultaneously and hella fast, the cost of that disconnection is compounding faster than most boards even realize. And the engineer CHRO, they're the ones that are going to be able to see the whole integration picture and fix it. All right, you know me, I love a good plan of action. So let's talk about three things that you can start doing this week to develop that mindset of an engineer. The first one is to run a boundary audit. Pick three processes that go across different functions and map out exactly what happens at each boundary. What is the information that is transferred? What system does it go into, and who owns that handoff? You're going to find at least one gap that's been quietly costing the business money, and that's the one that you can focus on. Start small. All right, number two, get into the AI integration conversation now. So, if your organization has multiple functions implementing AI right now, and it does, whether they're telling you or not, someone needs to be asking how those implementations connect. And that someone is you. Not to own the technology, not to own the decision of what vendor or which tool that you need to use, but to make sure that those outputs are talking to each other and that the people involved on both ends of that handoff are educated and working together. All right, number three, start with a gap log. So document those disconnects that you find, not as complaints, but as a business case. Put it in a backlog. Use it in swim lanes to be able to say, okay, this is the gap that I'm going to help these two departments work on first. Move it all the way from in progress to in review to done, and then pull the next one in on your backlog. But if you don't have that gap list documented, then you're going to get confused and it's not going to end well. So always start with documentation and use that as a to-do list and a checklist. And also, just a little bonus tip, in that document, find lessons that you learn as you solve the gaps, because chances are a lesson that you learn solving one gap can be used and iterated upon for the next gap that you want to solve. So let's wrap this up on the engineer persona for the modern CHRO. They're not going to generate more reports. They wire the signals together so that the system can kind of speak for itself. And they find the failure points before they become a crisis. The whole goal of the engineer system thinking type of mindset is to get HR out of the crisis hotline and into the boardroom and affecting strategy. If you like this video and you want to get caught up on the previous two, I'll drop them in the description link. And the next one is the scientist. So if the engineer closes the gap in a system, the scientist figures out a way that those gaps never even exist in the first place. So we're going to move from fixing the handoff to understanding the data behind why people decisions go wrong and how you can change them. I am Trent Cotton, the human capitalist. Remember to invest in yourself because no one's going to do it quite like you do.